I'd like to pay my respects to the land that we stand on, the Gadigal peoples, elders past and present, and acknowledge, as forever remains in my consciousness, the atrocities that our Aboriginal peoples were dealt with, the First Peoples, the First Nations cultures, since colonialism, and they should never be forgotten. I pay my regards and respect to Auntie Joan and to all the luminaries who are in this room, and each and every one of you are that. So I pay that equally to all of you for being here. And I can't go without a special mention to the Honourable Shawkat Mosselmain. What he does is unbelievable work. I've crossed paths with most parliamentarians over a couple of generations, and there are many good people among them. He's an exceptionally good one. I did have a prepared yarn here. I've decided not to go with it. I folded it all up. I listened to Helen particularly, to Pino and to Gary cover a lot of what I was going to cover, and I don't think, even if it comes from a different perspective, that it's as useful as hearing new information. So I'm going to take a chance and just throw a few things out there. Nevertheless, one thing I do have in common with Helen, though, is my uncle, between 1960 to 1967, was the chef on board the Patrice. I also am of Greek heritage. Both my parents were migrants. They never went to school, they never had an education. They came here as poor as they come, and they worked hard all their lives. And what I have myself as the eldest of six, and what my 5 brothers and sisters have, is their sacrifices, the legacy of their sacrifices, and many of yourselves in this room are in that same boat, in that same position. I grew up as a migrant child with that whole sense of otherness, and I never thought I had it hard or any different than anyone else, because I did integrate. I did mix it with those I grew up with. But what did actually scar me for a long time was many of the same things I went through that Helen actually talked about. Being the firstborn, yes, I had to go to council and speak on behalf of my family or other people within our community, and to their employers, and to the factories, and to every imaginable agency out there. But I also spent a lot of my youth representing, in those days in the 70s, mesothelioma victims of asbestosis who were Greek. And they didn't have anyone to speak for them. The unions in those days weren't ready to overwhelm the language barriers. And I never got anywhere with it, talking to their employers, trying to get them some just outcomes for themselves or their families, and we know what the whole struggle about that is. But I also saw that it wasn't just a cost-benefit exploitation. It was also the use of race to overwhelm outcome, to prevent that cost-benefit loss to the organisation or an admission of liability. They'd use the language barrier, or they'd use the cultural barriers against them. It broke my heart as a young person to see people all wired up in beds, gasping, for a breath, and to be treated in such ways by high-level management, by people who owned organisations, enterprise, and to know that they could get away with it and then do it. And that racism, because the veils and layers of racism are many and varied, and within those layers we all get caught up, and there is a hostile identity crisis still in this country in its denial of its historical racism and the extent of it. But that was racism in itself, to use a racial issue or to use cultural barriers and to overwhelm an outcome that should have been to the benefit of what is humanity. I've spent most of my life in the tertiary sector, and I've spent a lot of research and study in trying to unveil and understand what racism is so we can move forward. Not to argue it and not to hold people accountable or hostage to it, but that we move forward. Anyway, I do write for a lot of news media now. I've moved away from the tertiary sector. 3 years ago, I moved out of the big city with my young daughter and my wife, and we moved to a little country town. And I downsized my life and decided that, you know, I could live within my means and not wait till I'm 65 to retire to a country town. And it's been a good thing for us, but with that came the opportunity of a new career. And I got contacted by the National Indigenous Times, who I've, you know, assisted because I've been in the Aboriginal health sector and field in other ways for 3 decades. And I was asked if I'd write for them. And I said, okay, yes. And I did. And the last 3 years I've been writing for the National Indigenous Times, for the Fairfax Press, for the rural media, rural press media, and other regional media. And I've spent 30 years sourcing stories for various news media, and I know how hard it is to get the right story in there. It's easy to get the story in there, but to get the pitch, to get what needs to get out about that story. With the National Indigenous Times, I've had the opportunity to highlight stories that no one else was prepared to highlight. I've been able to carry stories out on native title, and people, other journalists, you know, have let it go because they do treat our First Nations people a little bit differently, if I can just be kind with my words here and circumspect, than what they do non-Indigenous people. Native title isn't what it should be. And native title is about acting in good faith. Many of the mining companies don't act in good faith. Pursuant the last 6 months of a particular resource company in the Pilbara, of how they've steamrolled the Yindjibarndi peoples, there is now a national inquiry as a result of those articles in the National Indigenous Times, which have now been carried by the ABC 7:30 report in December and January. The National Native Title Tribunal launched an inquiry, and the political landscape is changing. And what could have happened and continue to have happened to the Yindjibarndi peoples, and happens to others, is not happening any longer. Outcomes have changed for them. And that's the positive of what news media can do and achieve. And news media, and especially multicultural media, ethnic media, really does need to work with the mainstream media, because we're all part of the one media, in my opinion. We do have to source the stories for them, and especially in a climate where they are increasingly under-resourced, less staff than what they used to have in terms of, you know, cost benefit. You know, we all understand that the climate at the moment, financial, for these organisations, and they come to us, whether it be a regional newspaper, whether it be an ethnic community newspaper or medium, whether it be an Indigenous newspaper or medium. Stories that we were able to get into the Australian, for instance, actually changed the landscape. And when we wrote about Elcho Island, which is an island off the Northern Territory, Tiwi Islands, about homelessness there for Aboriginal people and families for 6 months. They were sleeping in tents while the refurbishments for their houses were taking far too long. Once we got that out, we broke on the ground in covering that story. It was sourced into the Australian. Within 2 weeks of that happening, the houses were finished. And it was important because the monsoonal rains were about to come, and they were just finished in time 1 week before the December monsoonal rains. I could give you a litany of the stories that, you know, that we've got through Indigenous specific news media, and it's not just contained to us at the National Indigenous Times. It's also National Indigenous Television, NITV, which is a phenomenal thing that's actually happened. That's actually out there, free to air, since December of last year. And also in the ethnic media, that we do get out, and we have to get out more, because those voices that we can give rise to, and especially in the climate where other media, mainstream media, be it whomever they are, the major broadcasters or the major tabloids, they're looking more to us than they've ever looked before, or to work, you know, even if they'll consider us, you know, as stringers for them, a journalistic term that most of you would be aware of. One story that I spent 3 years and 3.5 years of my life campaigning on, and also outside journalism, was Indonesian children in adult prisons. 3.5 years ago, I've been visiting prisons for about 8.5 years, and trying to help those into alternate pathway programs, education, employment opportunities, and so forth. At Hakea Prison in Perth, I came across 30 Indonesians in prison that looked far too young, and I questioned their age. When I tried to get that into various news media, after going all the way and exhausting every mechanism with the superintendent of the prison, with the Department of Immigration and Citizenship, with the consulates which were actually supportive of the Indonesian and did want to exact change, but there's diplomacy, DFAT, and every other organisation and agency, and I won't list them all. I went all the way to the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, firstly, and then Julia Gillard. One major news broadcaster said to me when I broke the story and said we need to get it out en masse to Australia so we can exact change and get these 100 children out of prison, they said to me, but they're Indonesian, Gerry. No one cares about, I'll delete the word I was about to say. No one cares about the Indonesian children as they do their own in this country. And they're also seen as people smugglers because they were coming across as the cooks and deckhands on boats assisting others in the safe passage to asylum. And they were being held hostage and victim. But the fact is these children were 13, 14, 15, 16, and there were between 70 to 100 in our prisons, 27 in WA alone. It took me 3 years. It took me 3 years to get them released. And to do that, we needed the cultural wave. To do that, we needed everyone working together. It took me 1.5 years to finally get it into mainstream media. And it was actually Lindsay Murdoch of The Age who finally did the job for us or whatever, right, and got it on every front page in the country more than 2 years ago. And then I had to work with all the other news media around the country to almost pro forma what would go out, the stories, and take the humanity of these people across to the Australian consciousness. In the end, the Australian Human Rights Commission, as a result of the cultural wave, came in on board as a result of these stories, as a result of the leverage from media. It wouldn't have happened any other way. Their Human Rights Unit actually launched a national inquiry. We started working with politicians and everybody, and the majority of these children, or age disputes as they call them, have now been released thanks to the then Attorney General Nicola Roxon. So without the medium of the press, we wouldn't have got these stories out. And what it highlighted to me more so was the racial issues, the cultural problems that we still, and predicaments we still need to overwhelm. And only an ethnic press can do that. But I also have to be careful when I say the word ethnic press, multicultural press, because for me, when I sometimes hear about cultures and cultural diversity and protecting our identities and so on or whatever, right, we're all multicultural. Multicultural is an ongoing thing, and it has been from the beginning of time. We're all, colonialists are part of that multiculture. What multiculturalism means to me is a governance, a policy, a management system to actually assist and protect cultural diversity. Our borders these days are much more seamless than what they were before, and transmigration is en masse and people move around. And we've got all the instruments now that bring us also closer together and an onus of each other upon each other. So for myself, multiculturalism is a system about ensuring that we protect each other. Do not necessarily push the whole assimilationist thing where people become the property of people and we have to change our views to become the property of a particular view or a predominant culture. Okay, so 3 minutes. So look, with media at the crossroads, it couldn't be more pertinent, because as is multiculturalism an ongoing and an inclusive and an all-encompassing for everybody, media is always at the crossroads. We're always at the crossroads. Humanity is always at the crossroads. In the pursuit of a civil society, we're always at the crossroads. Unfolding a human rights language, unfolding our social justice, vocabulary, we're always at the crossroads. And I think for us it's always apt, as Majida said, to take the challenges on and move forward and work together and all make a difference and have the courage. And one term that I love to put out there is through care journalism. Journalism can't just be about reporting a story and then dropping that story, whatever, or just getting the news and the facts out. It's got to go a little bit further. Through care journalism means sustaining coverage till the outcomes are done. Until the outcomes, and if the outcomes haven't happened, we have to ask the questions and sustain that coverage as to why this isn't being done. We can't just believe in incremental change. We've got to believe that we can make a difference ourselves. Without being caught up in and becoming biased and prejudiced, we've got to ensure that we stay involved in what we actually do. And I think we have that capacity, and that capacity is now growing more and more, and especially as the voices of all the cultural identities that we have in this country have, broken some of the shackles of the fear that they've actually had in taking upon challenges that 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago that they had, that were more worrisome to themselves. I say throw the gauntlet out, chase down what you can, make a difference. As you make more difference, so do you actually leverage your power within community, your power within the news medium, your respect from others who we may call the mainstream media, and we're all part of that mainstream media, and we need to make sure that our cultural identity is the equivalent and also our capacity to exact change and influence is the equivalent of what mainstream media actually has. There are many things I'd love to talk about. I'm a very long-winded person, it's the Greek in me, but it's given me great pride to be here, and I think I think we've got to respect one another, our First Peoples, which are hundreds of cultures, and all the peoples that have come since, and we've got to respect each other in terms of an unfolding human rights language and a social justice vocabulary, and we have a capacity to make a difference, and we are. Thank you.